Everybody's agenda is pretty tight today because of the meetings, and so we'll start and people will be coming. We had a good number of our RSVPs, so we should have twice as much people as many people as we have now. Good morning. My name is Paulo Sotero. I'm the director of the Brazil Institute here at the Wilson Center. It is a pleasure to welcome you here this morning to discuss for this conversation about Brazil's macroeconomic prospects at this time of crisis. We have with us four excellent presenters, people that are very knowledgeable about Brazil, that are deeply involved with the country in different ways, starting with Secretary for Economic Affairs, Paulo Guilherme Fará Correia, who works directly with Minister Joaquim Levy, has experience, a lot of experience working in the Brazilian government and in the multilateral community, worked here at the World Bank, and is part of the group of advisors assembled by Joaquim Levy to tackle this very hard mission of stabilizing or reestablishing fiscal equilibrium and restoring confidence in Brazil's economic policy management. We have also, I will not read the biography of everybody that's here, and you know these people. So, it's a pleasure also to welcome back Lisa Schneller, an economist and managing director of Latin America, sovereign rates at Standard & Poor's. In 2008, Lisa joined us at a session we had in Congress, on Capitol Hill, under much happier circumstances. Standard & Poor's had just upgraded Brazil to investment grade level, and it was a feast. We had. It was a very interesting event, so things have changed. In the order that they will speak, I will now introduce Arturo Porzekanski. Arturo is an economist, now a distinguished economist in residence and director of the International Economic Relations Program at American University School of International Service here in town. Arturo has had a lot of experience on Brazil in good and bad times. Obviously, I remember, have fond memories of the time. It now can be told he was a source of mine during the 80s financial crisis when he was at Morgan. And thank God Bill Rhodes is not here, because I just revealed something that I kept for 30 years. I had some very good friends in that were following Brazil for the creditor banks, and Arturo was one of the people that really helped me understand the process, and was in the very difficult year of '99. I remember, Arturo, you gave me an interview that allowed me to write a headline for Estado de São Paulo when everybody was predicting a recession for that year in Brazil. You were the only person that predicted that Brazil would grow. That year, the recession would be short, and actually it was a pretty good piece, and I owe it to you. We have also with us Monica de Bol. She is an economist, now a visiting fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. She was for a few months with us here as a global fellow of the Brazil Institute. Monica taught at Catholic University, the School of the Economics program at the Catholic University in Rio. Is a very well connected to leading economists in Brazil. Has, I think, her presence now in Washington is very helpful in terms of, explaining the macroeconomic picture for audiences, both American and other audiences in Washington. With that, I asked each of the speakers, starting with Paulo, to talk about 15 minutes, and I don't think that they're going to use PowerPoint, probably not necessary in the current circumstances. And so we would start with Paulo, and then Lisa, Arturo, and Monica, and then we will open for questions. This is being webcast, so we probably have a lot of people to following the proceedings, and if they have questions, they will send those to us, and I will read them here. But Paulo, please, you're welcome to start us off.
Paulo, muito obrigado. Thank you very much. I was tempted to congratulate you in Portuguese, but given the advance in time, so let's get started to business. I wanted to thank you, Paulo, for organizing this event. Thank my fellow panelists for being here this morning, and thank you all for taking the time to hear us a bit, bringing good news about the country that has been bringing good news for some time now. So what I planning to do is to, I assume that you are more or less familiar with the fiscal strategy. We can discuss this a bit later. What I wanted to do here this morning is to focus a little bit more on the agenda of microeconomic reforms, or what is at some point will become a microeconomic agenda of reforms at some point, because it's not at this stage yet. So what I wanted to spend the next 50 minutes or so is to share with you some of those ideas that we will try to put forward to establish new basis for sustained and sustainable as well growth in Brazil, hopefully starting next year already. So a little background and context on this. I don't have to emphasize how much Brazil progressed in social terms in the last decade, certainly up to the end of 2013. I think it's the term spectacular is not an exaggeration in terms of, especially in terms of the growth of the income of the bottom of the population. If you want to use the concept of shared prosperity, which is the growth of income of the 40% at the bottom, we had about 6.5% per year. This is Chinese levels as compared to half of this growth for the average population. This is an achievement, and we are all engaged in the effort to preserve it, and why not to say to reestablish a sustainable basis for the continuation of this process of the development of the middle class. We know that part of the success had to do with a strategy that responded to national and international circumstances that are not valid anymore, that are not present anymore. I'm sure that you all know this, but just to pinpoint a few of them, the boom of commodities is over. The Great Recession, we are leaving behind at different stages, but we are more or less leaving behind. There were, because of the Great Recession, some monetary policies in developed countries kind of disorganized a little bit. Also, some of the key prices like domestic interest rates and exchange rates. So we bring that into place again. But more importantly, from an internal point of view, we had fiscal space to adopt some counter-cyclical measures that are not valid anymore, are not possible anymore. As you know, this model came to a point in which macroeconomic imbalances from the external point of view and from the internal point of view on the fiscal side came to an exhaustion. The president had mentioned this a couple of times herself. So the overall vision now is that once you reestablish the basics of a new cycle of a new moment of growth, through fiscal stability, what you need is to try to unleash some reforms that would enable productivity gains and increase the potential growth rates of the country, and to put in a simple way, address supply side issues that are still pending and are therefore opportunities for the country as well. So a shift from demand side growth to supply side growth is inevitable given the new circumstances of international economy and our domestic reality as well. To do that, we started making sure that some prices, we would get right some basic prices, as I just said. And you saw the movement with the exchange rate. You saw some, what in Portuguese we have been calling realismo tarifário, which is to bring back the tariffs to reflect the costs, especially in energy. This comes with a high political cost, as you know, so I think it shows the commitment of this government to bring back some basic foundations of sustained growth in a context where the previous policies are not possible anymore. And on more on the micro level, a couple of initiatives that I wanted to highlight. First is affects infrastructure investments, is the fact that you probably heard last week, BNDES is changing its approach since the investments made in the past are not available anymore. BNDES is rethinking its approach, and one way to do that is to, well, you saw that the difference between TJLP and interest rates reduced and is reducing significantly, and BNDES is now rethinking its financing of infrastructure in Brazil. Besides its normal operation, it will, as you saw last week, it will adopt a kind of matching scheme. Matching is a simplification, of course, but the idea is that access to TJLP will be conditioned to investors issuing project bonds. For those who are familiar with the market in Brazil, this could be the use of debêntures incentivadas or any similar project bonds. The details are being worked out. Another measure that normally is seen from just from a fiscal standpoint, but has also important microeconomic effects, is the reduction, is the adjustments in the unemployment benefits. And why I'm highlighting this? I'm highlighting this because labor economists will remember one of the issues we discussed forever now is the incentives to rotate that exist in the Brazilian labor market. So by adjusting access to unemployment, what you're going to do is you're going to reduce the incentives for rotation. We've heard from many business associations, especially, as you can imagine, in the service sector, in the trade sector, big retailers, already mentioning us that they expect a significant positive effect in terms of reducing the incentives to rotate. For those who are not familiarized with the topic, one of the problems is that as the incentives are to rotate, there's an equilibrium in which the individuals do not invest in human capital, and the tendency is that the companies do not invest in human capital either, because they will not rip off the benefits apart from the natural externalities. So this is an issue that is being at least partially addressed with this type of measure. I wanted to just to perhaps mention a couple of other things that are underway, and you probably have heard in the area of international trade. We have been putting, we continue to place, because it started before this administration, a lot of emphasis on trade facilitation measures. And I want to make a pause here to make sure you all understand the importance of those measures. It has been taken in the past as an alternative for the fact that the Doha round of negotiations was not very promising. But we understand now how important it is. Just to give you an idea, the time to clear customs for imports in Brazil, imports, because this is an important, it's in a globalized economy, that's an important way to get updated inputs for your business and gain productivity. The equivalent of this time, excessive time to clear business, at some point meant the equivalent of an import tariff of up to 20%. Thank you, Monica. Sorry. Up to 20% of the magnitude of 20%. So we are, together with Ministry of Industry and Trade, we are working hard. There's a priority to reduce the time to clear customs. There are a number of initiatives we can discuss later on around the simplification of customs processes. And what the studies show, by the way, and I'm be glad to share with you some of these studies, that there's a particular impact on the manufacturing sector. So just to make it a bit more clearer, this trade, the time to clear customs affect both exports and imports. So if you look at the export side, it also you can quantify as a tariff equivalent, and then when you do the calculations, what you see is that if you bring this to our targets, you can generate a lot of gains in terms of exports, and the impact is bigger in the manufacturing sector. So it's not only that the exchange rate is going to help us to recover exports, but it's also that more fundamental microeconomic initiatives are underway to help to increase those exports and exports of manufacturing. It's still in the area of competitiveness and with the emphasis in reducing obstacles to productivity gains and therefore to foster trade participation. We are exploring together with the Ministry of Industry and Trade ways to, within the context of our international commitments, especially the regional commitments, to see how we can review the level of tariffs that exist now in Brazil, particularly in sectors that are inputs and are at the basis of the most important value chains of Brazilian exports. So as you know, the import of inputs are in general a very important source of knowledge and a very quick source of productivity gains, and therefore a way to help to increase our trade integration. And finally, in the part of logistics, I think we are putting a lot of emphasis in unlocking the potential for investments in ports. We can discuss this more later on, but there's a huge investment in the last 2 years in private terminals as a result of the new port legislation. This is very important for us, but there is still a pending issues more broadly in public ports with the concessions that we need to address, and we are looking carefully at this. We are taking the appropriate measures to unlock these investments as well. So there is finally a last point that is not underway, but I think will give you a bit of a sense of where we would like to go. We talked about productivity gains, but I didn't give you any basic understanding of what's going on in Brazil. So the way we see it is that a lot of the productivity gains in the country can be achieved through fostering the structural adjustment in the productive capacity of the country. That means that if you let more efficient firms to grow, less efficient firms to reduce the size or even exit the market more efficiently, that's going to make a huge impact in aggregate productivity and aggregate productivity growth. So unlocking this process of structural adjustment is another challenge. How do you do that? It's a combination of measures. This is a long-term agenda, of course, but one of the issues is tax simplification. You probably have seen the discussions about the reform in ICMS, the VAT tax. This is one big topic for us. The minister himself is very convinced of the distortionary impacts on the productivity of firms. So while a very important tax, if we need to make sure that what is happening among states does not evolve anymore to a situation in which the decision to open up a business or how you run a business is affected by this type of taxes, and therefore not by the optimal decision of location of firms. So a lot of other initiatives in the area of tax simplification that are being worked by our Receita Federal. We can talk about this a little bit more. And finally, a point that we have not started yet, but we plan at some point to address more carefully is what I call broadly and borrowing from the EU legislation, the state aids. So all the set of tax exemptions or subsidies, so transfers, broadly speaking, from the federal government to the private sector, to the enterprises. This adds up to a good, almost 2/3 of the fiscal adjustment that we need to make right now, or more, depending on how you calculate. And we have very little capacity to understand what we're getting out of it in terms of impact, and what is the effect in terms of competition in the marketplace, and therefore how much it's promoting these adjustment, this structural adjustment towards more efficient firms, or on the other way around, it's working as an obstacle to this adjustment happen carefully, so efficiently. So there is also an effort in this direction, meaning that to look at the quality of public expenditures, particularly in this respect on incentives transfer from the government, from the federal government to the private sector, and try to understand the impacts in terms of not only in terms of cost effectiveness, but also in terms of the efficiency of this adjustment that I just mentioned. So I think I managed to stay within the 15 minutes and perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paulo. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think to start off, I think to put in context, we recently affirmed our BBB- rating on Brazil, foreign currency, and maintained the stable outlook on the rating. To put this recent rating action in context, we had downgraded Brazil's rating last March of 2014. And why? At that point, we had the expectation that the combination of Brazil's growth dynamics and fiscal trajectory were going to be weaker moving forward than we had seen in recent years. And also then question of the policy adjustment after the elections under a second Dilma administration. So we had foreseen that, going to continue to have some weaker fiscal outturns and inability to meet a stated fiscal target absent maneuvering in the fiscal accounts. And that growth was going to be lower. You had a question of energy risk, rationing, the issues of declining business sentiment ahead of the elections, policy uncertainty, et cetera. All of this as the macroeconomic credibility had taken a hit in recent years and really impacted the outlook, I think, for growth, business sentiment, et cetera. Over the course of the year, we saw kind of, in the end of the day, the fiscal slippage turned out to be even greater than we had expected. And you could see that, over the course of the year, with some, kind of the pedaladas coming to the forefront of the news story. But importantly, automatic adjustments happening within Brazil's institutional system, as they are brought to light and then reversed, although still leaving some significant fiscal slippage. And the growth story turned out to be even weaker from a point estimate point of view than we expected. So here we are, kind of with these weaker conditions, as well as a newer development around the kind of taking, kind of the news headlines is the corruption investigations at Petrobras really taking off more around the time of the election. However, post-election, you have seen then a significant correction in policy that we did not anticipate, in the sense that we assumed policy was going to be more of the same under a second Dilma administration, with mixed policy signals. Our base case was some change in the economic team, but not transferring to a significant reversal in policy, which we actually have. Some of the policies that Paulo outlined, and the kind of correction on the fiscal side that is being engineered is much deeper than we had anticipated, but coming from a weaker starting position. And for us, we're juxtaposing these two developments. And so despite the fact that we have a weaker fiscal story, somewhat even a weaker fiscal story on the debt side, as well as now our view is Brazil's growth story is even, while has always been on the low compared with some peers, somewhat even lower, given the significant challenges that we have at the moment. And we're expecting a contraction this year and a moderate recovery next year. Those deteriorations, however, we view likely to be more transitory because of the corrective policy measures going into place, okay, and hence the stable outlook. So we're assuming is that policy will be, the change in policy that is being articulated from the finance minister, gain support within the cabinet, which we see by ongoing support within the cabinet, ongoing support from the president, and that will also translate over into Congress as well. Clearly, it's an extremely complicated political scenario. And stepping back, we think you look at Brazil, does have a track record of actually adjusting more in a moment of stress, so to speak, than when things are on a smoother path. And our view is that Congress, articulation with Congress would improve, and actually, kind of around the time of our formal rating announcement, and since you've seen some of this happening with the finance minister articulating more with the PMDB, for as well as the vice president taking a leading role, and so things that we had foreseen that we were expecting to come about, some of that has already been coming about. But clearly, ongoing support is crucial. Many of the measures that the government is focusing on the fiscal side can be managed within the finance ministry itself. A significant part of, say, the adjustment this year is predicated that the finance ministry can manage. But it's important, however, to have broader support for that, and key components on some of the spending side need to be passed by Congress, and those are important measures for the medium term, to continually to improve the medium-term issues in terms of benefits, et cetera, some of which Paulo highlighted. And we're assuming that you will have Congress moving forward on some of these. Yes, some dilution, but overall, the political system will move in support in that direction. I think and if you look at the variety of policies that are being put forth, it is more than fiscal. And the key component is the fiscal. Another risk on the fiscal side, I would say, is the growth story and what that means for revenue performance. And therefore, the question of, the ability to meet a stated primary target. Our view is that our base case, you may not meet that target, but you will come fairly close. But it's the commitment and the intent is a key component of our analysis and these expectations. Again, the depth of a contraction, we're assuming a 1% contraction this year. Not that we want to get hung up on a point estimate, but it's the notion of you're going to have an economic contraction. You have significant pressure, headwinds coming from the policy correction underway, but the investigations into the corruption allegations at Petrobras importantly weigh on business sentiment as Petrobras is cutting its investment, but its ripple effects through its supply chain, the construction sector more broadly, and this is an important weighs on growth importantly. The question of energy is seemingly abated somewhat for the near term, given some rain, but so it doesn't seem today as as quite as the chance of a rationing as you had a bit earlier in the year. But I think it's an important point to keep on the table moving for next year, because even if you don't have rationing, water levels, depending on what happens, will still remain somewhat tight. And the perennial question of an energy rationing does have an impact on business sentiment. So I think it's, in our view, kind of, again, the slower growth outlook over the coming years, part of that has to do with a persistent question on the energy side. On the fiscal side, kind of, again, while this growth dynamic kind of may impede somewhat the actual attainment of a primary target, I think the important articulation of a clear target and an attempt to reach that is key. The LDO that came out this week reinforces kind of that general stance. It's also that it's a multi-year adjustment, kind of with ideally further tightening of policy next year. That said, we still see the debt trajectory moving higher over the next several years, given in part the size of the adjustment, the fiscal adjustment, as well as the reality of the growth story. And the weight of the interest burden, given given what has happened, monetary policy tightening cycle, given the exchange rate dynamics and its impact on the swap program, et cetera. So we have a weaker fiscal assessment than we've had before. But again, we expect it with time that this should improve. A point that I would also want to put on the table is contingent liabilities. Question will get Petrobras. How do we look at that? We actually have maintained Petrobras's overall rating at BBB-, though we have a negative outlook on it in contrast to the sovereign. And that is reflecting risks more on its standalone credit profile. Well, the way we look at Petrobras is we look at it from its financial profile, a component of its rating, but then an important component coming from government support, i.e., in the moment of stress, the likelihood of the government stepping in to help provide support for Petrobras to avoid a default. So our methodology brings the two together. Given the pressures on the financial profile of Petrobras, we have lowered this component of the rating, its standalone credit profile. And if that assessment goes even one notch lower, assuming there's no change in our view of government support, that would bring Petrobras to the speculative grade category. And hence we wanted to signal those risks, which are more medium term in terms of leverage, et cetera, dynamics to the investor community. That said, we still attribute a high likelihood of support, a very high likelihood of support, as we define that term, coming from the government. And so the Petrobras rating is a blend of support. How does this feed back to the sovereign rating? In a moment, we look at contingent liabilities, okay, and that is incorporated in our fiscal debt assessment. And so we've thought through the fact the risk of a 6 percentage point, more or less, of GDP moving on to the government's balance sheet. How would that compare with our kind of current level of debt, which is about 50%, as we define net general government debt, different than the government's definition? And to this date, that wouldn't necessarily lead to a worse kind of fiscal assessment from our point of view. But as the government debt rises, and depending on the size of Petrobras, these are things that we would be monitoring. So to date, it doesn't kind of have additional weight on our assessment, but it's clearly we look at all state-owned enterprises, the size of their debt, their financial independent kind of creditworthiness, as how that, we feed that into our contingent liability analysis. And so far, they haven't hit negatively, so to speak. But this is obviously a key component of our analysis. And finally, to sum up, stable outlook, we're expecting the correction underway to be maintained and to generate kind of improvements in the fiscal trajectory and the growth story over time. And it depends, importantly, on articulation of some of the points that Paolo highlighted. Because besides regaining credibility on the macro side, strengthening the basis for growth, given the structural reform agenda has been stalled for quite some time, is very important, given the change in the global context. And our expectation is that some of these, the government, this will move onto the government more agenda, more pointedly in the coming months. That will then, kind of offset some of the drag coming from these near-term pressures. If there's slippage in policy and kind of stepping back from policy, that and deterioration in key indicators, that's something that you think of in terms of downside for the rating. In contrast, kind of a real consolidation of these measures, leading to even stronger dynamics down the road for upside in the rating.
Okay, Lisa, thank you very much. Arturo.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here with these wonderful colleagues. When I used to work on Wall Street, of course, my job entailed trying to anticipate what policymakers like Paolo would do and what credit analysts like Lisa would also do in the future, because what they do and they don't get done impacts very much on the financial markets. So the idea was to be a step ahead and look over the horizon. But now that I'm firmly planted in academia, I don't get paid to do that, and I'm not going to do that. And so I'm going to try to give more of a perspective, because thank goodness, the short term, whether from a policymaker's perspective or a rating agency analyst's perspective, have been very well covered in the past half hour. So, for instance, I'm going to talk about, or have some reflections about the rating scale used by the agencies. Because remember, when they rate a sovereign like Brazil, triple B or triple B minus or whatever it is, they are trying to transmit their view of the probability of default. That's what it is. It's not the business climate, it's not the weather, it's not how good the hotels are or the food, it's a probability of default. But there is life beyond that, I discovered. And so we should ask ourselves, what rating would we give Brazil in other dimensions? Are they still investment grade or are they junk? And I would say, if you take the temperature of the disappointment or lack thereof, whether it's of the middle class in Brazil or the business leadership and the entrepreneurial forces in Brazil, or even the foreign partners of Brazil, be they the regional partners or the United States or Europe or others, well, there's a lot of disappointment, and they're definitely not investment grade. That's a reality, and we have to talk about that. And also, of course, it could be a relative disappointment relative to potential. If you had gone back 10 years ago and said, where Brazil would be in 2015, you would have to admit that in many respects there is a huge gap relative to potential. And so in that regard too, I think Brazil is not investment grade. Now, what happened? I think what happened was, above all, that the legacy of the Cardoso years was misspent. At least at the end of the Cardoso years, we could look at ourselves in the mirror and say, honestly, at least what we would call the macro economic situation had been fixed. The key prices, exchange rate, interest rates, energy prices, and so on were set right and mostly set by market forces. The central bank had tremendous credibility and was mostly on target. Fiscal and monetary policies were judicious. On the fiscal side, as you might know, the budget was never actually balanced, but at least a significant so-called primary, namely exempting interest payments, a primary surplus had been recorded. And interest rates in general were positive in real terms and were guiding inflation down. And of course, the interventionist role of government in production, whether the production of electricity or the production of oil or the production of key services, public utilities and so on, had been scaled back through privatizations and other measures. And we all knew, looking at ourselves in the mirror and speaking the truth, that a huge agenda of so-called micro economic reforms was yet to be tackled. The labor market was excessively regulated, encouraging a huge black market or parallel market in labor. The tax system was very burdensome, very complex, very arbitrary, very difficult to live with. There were a lot of trade facilitation related red tape issues, whether with internal commerce or foreign trade. And there were obvious gaps in infrastructure. Everything from roads to ports to everything was antiquated and insufficient and so on. And the hope was that in the 10 years after Cardozo stepped down and the PT came to power, at least some of these micro reforms would be attempted. Because oftentimes experience from other countries shows that, for instance, it takes a labor leader to reform the labor laws. And it takes someone who has not enjoyed subsidies and directed credit and tax breaks and so on to reform the tax code and to reform the role of entities like BNDES and so on that try to pick winners and they're never, labor. So that was the expectation. That is why there is a disappointment relative to potential and relative to what has happened. And this is now a heavy legacy of things that were not done and things that were reversed because the macro is not right. The central bank is not credible. Just look at the forecast for inflation that the market participants make. It's not only that they don't expect inflation to come down now, they don't expect it to come down next year or the year after, despite these high interest rates. And certainly not significantly. We're still talking about huge numbers. And what has happened? Well, what has happened is that in the last decade or so, the emphasis has shifted from growth and efficiency and the private sector being the leading force of economic development to other goals. For instance, an emphasis on income redistribution, which has its good side, because indeed you have now a lot of poor people getting government support, and some of them have moved on from poverty. Many of them have moved from poverty to at least the lower middle class, and people have benefited from energy subsidies and all kinds of things. But there is a downside that is seldom talked about, which is that, now you have a welfare state, for better and for worse. You have a lot of people with no incentive to work, and certainly not in the formal market where it's very difficult to hire and very difficult to fire. and very costly to do so. So there is a whole downside to this emerging middle class because a lot of it was artificial, was based on all kinds of government incentives that distorted the economy and are unaffordable and create their own legacies. Another priority was, I would call it, self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency in all kinds of ways, through protectionism, renewed protectionism, so there was a rollback of trade liberalization, through renewed protectionism, through a policy of picking winners and giving them credit and subsidies and so on. A lot of efficiency was lost along the process. A lot of transparency was lost, a lot of process. So, you know, what we're seeing in Petrobras, who knows if the light was, the spotlight was put on other government entities, you know, what we would find, say, inside BNDES. God knows what is in there. I'm not talking necessarily about corruption. It may just be bad loans that are not recognized as such, but that's also bad. So now, fiscal and monetary policy, which were able in 2002 and again in 2008 and 2009 to be anti-cyclical, namely government spending could increase and the money supply could be loosened when the economy was threatened by low growth. Now it has to be pro-cyclical again. So here we have, in the midst of a recession, the government having to raise tax revenues and cut spending, and the central bank having to raise interest rates and so on. And that's a damning reversal of fortune, because the whole idea was never to be in this spot again. The good news is that the president, I think, realizes the problem and has brought in people like Minister Levy and a great team with people like Paulo to right the ship of state. I hope they get a lot done. It's a huge agenda because, as was mentioned, there are elements of the macro situation that have to be fixed, and there are many elements of the micro situation that have to be fixed also. First, undone, and then pick up the pieces and do what was supposed to have been done, or we hope that would have been done 10 years ago. So in sum, I don't mean to be pessimistic or anything. I mean to add some perspective on where we are, because Paulo would not be here saying what he has said, and Lisa would not be here signaling some of the things that she has signaled if we hadn't had this trajectory, this lamentable trajectory during the past 10 years. So I don't think we have to be pessimistic. We just have to be realistic about the task that's ahead for a relatively small technocratic team with relatively hard to obtain political support in the Congress, and with a lot of distractions using up the airwaves. So they're swimming against the current, and it's better that they're swimming against the current than letting themselves float down the dam, you know, with the current. But it's a titanic struggle because Brazil is a large, complex economy with a lot of government intervention at all levels. So changing that is not easy. So I'm looking for other people to be brought into the cabinet who will also swim against the current. Because there are how many cabinet members? I think over 30. No?
38, 39.
38, 39. So one down, 37 to go. That's my view. And likewise with other areas of policy making and certainly of political support. So I think we should not hold our breath for miracles, but we should definitely applaud all efforts to right the ship of state and hope for the best, and hope that if and when we meet again 10 years from now, I'll be the one with a big smile on. Thank you.
Thank you, Arturo. Monica.
Thank you. What I'm going to try to do, there's a few things that I want to highlight on my own, but I'm going to touch, I think, on a bit on what everyone has said, and I'm going to start from Arturo down this way, so that I make my remarks at the end of things. Arturo said one thing that I think is key to really understand the situation that we're in at the moment. He said at the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, it appeared that the macro had been fixed. Now, this is a problem on its own because, as we know, we shouldn't take anything for granted. And I think to a large extent, Brazil took for granted that the macro had been fixed. And by taking for granted that the macro had been fixed, we used this extraordinary period of very, very favorable external conditions to do some things that were important, but not enough to get the country on a solid growth footing. And in fact, in the last 4 years, not only did we take advantage of the macro had been fixed story to do a lot of unfixing of the macro policies, but we also did a number of other things on the microeconomic front, things like local content requirements, introduction of local content requirements that really make the economy work in a very inefficient way. Having said this, as Lisa was pointing out, there is an extremely important and very, very wide-ranging process of policy correction underway in Brazil. And it's not just the fiscal. Lisa highlighted the fiscal to a large extent, but she did say it's not just the fiscal. And indeed, it's not just the fiscal. There's been a significant shift in exchange rate policy in Brazil. So up until very recently, we had the central bank intervening heavily in foreign exchange markets. It has, since the beginning of the year, put this sort of on a back burner. So it's not happening as much as it was happening before. And as a result of this, we have seen a significant devaluation of the real. Now, of course, the real devaluation also has other factors that come with it, such as dollar strengthening globally. But nonetheless, it has been a correction that was very much overdue, the correction in exchange rates that has taken place. Yes, as Arturo said, we do have a policy credibility problem at the central bank. My own research has focused on this in recent years, and we see very clearly how policy credibility in Brazil has gone down quite substantially on monetary policy. But I do see, some reason for hope in terms of the overall macro strategy that's been put in place. So where in the last few years we pretty much had the central bank swimming against a very, very strong tide of a lot of credit being given out, fiscal profligacy to a large extent. We now have the finance ministry and the central bank working together, so we have consistency between monetary and fiscal policy, which is also something that is very, very important to realize. So I expect that, credibility is always very, very hard to regain once you've lost it, but at some point, this process should happen to the extent that the kind of consistency that we're seeing in macro policies today remains, and I have every expectation that it will. Coming now to the things that Paulo has said, and he's highlighted a number of extremely, extremely important things on the reform front, and this is where I think we really should be looking, because crises come and crises go. Countries undergo crisis and they come out of crisis. If we look at Europe, for example, 5 years ago when the European crisis started, no one thought that Europe was going to come, 5 years from then, was going to have facilities such as the ESF, the ESM, was going to have an actual discussion about a banking union. Lots of these institutional things that seemed extremely hard at the time have been done over the last 5 years. And they have been done because there was a need for them. In the same vein, I don't want to compare Brazil and Europe too much, but in the same vein, a number of things that had to be done and were not done over the last few years now need to get done. And I think the good message that we've heard here, and the very important message that we've heard from Paulo, is that a number of these things are effectively being done. Let me touch upon the growth story and the sort of potential growth story very briefly, because this is something that my current research is focusing on at the moment. Once we do come out of this crisis, and I have every expectation that we will come out with the sort of macro framework that we have in place at the moment, Brazil still has a very, very challenging road ahead. I mean, we're looking at a situation where the country, once it gets its, its macroeconomic side of things in order, and some of these micro reforms as well, is still, a country that we can't really see growing much beyond 2 to 2.5% a year. That is very low compared to its emerging market peers. That is very low even if we compare it within Latin America, taking aside, of course, the Argentinas and the Venezuelas of the world. So we have still a very, very challenging situation in terms of getting growth back. As I said, my own research at the moment with a colleague of mine in Brazil, Pedro Simões, we have been trying to do some estimates for potential growth in Brazil. We've come up with these numbers, 2.5%. And we have been trying to figure out exactly where, things would need to improve for us to get back to, say, 3.5 to 4% growth a year. Now, mind you, this is not even a very ambitious objective. We're talking about getting back to 3.5, 4%, which is, more or less how we were doing before the 2011 turnaround in the external environment. And for that to happen, first of all, we do need to have significant productivity gains. Paulo spoke extensively about this. What we see at the moment is that Brazilian productivity is currently not growing at all. It's stagnant. So we would need to at least get back to, say, 1% a year productivity growth. There's a huge effort that has to be begun now in order for that to happen. We need to get labor force participation back up. Brazilian labor force participation has fallen dramatically in the last few years. We're currently down to 56% in terms of labor force participation. That number would need to rise up to, say, about 60% for us to have a better outlook. And we would also need to get, investment and capacity utilization back to where it was before, the deconstruction of the last 4 years took place. So essentially what we're saying here is that we need to get productivity growth back, we need to get labor force participation up, and we need to get investment and capacity utilization back for us to be able to rise from 2% growth to 3.5 to 4% growth a year. So it's a very, very large reform agenda that has to be implemented, and I commend the government for laying out these things while having to do a very contentious fiscal adjustment at the same time in an extremely difficult environment. One thing that I think is key, and I was very glad to hear Paulo's remarks on this, is openness. Brazil remains as one of the most closed economies in the world. It needs urgently to have some kind of openness agenda. We do have a competitiveness agenda in Brazil, but I think we are, way behind the times in terms of looking at free trade agreements and free trade agreements outside of the very, very binding constraints of the Mercosur. So this is where I think, we have the potential for getting back some of these productivity gains, some of these investment gains, even some of this labor force participation that we need to get growth back if we do have a more ambitious strategy on trade and investment. There is a very, very big effort at the Peterson Institute in studying these issues, and I think Brazil would currently be missing an opportunity that is being so much in the public debate in the U.S. and elsewhere, even in Latin America. Brazil would be really missing out if it were not to get its head together and get its head around, what could be Brazil's actual integration into the world economy going forward. So with these remarks, I'll end here, and so that we can have a debate.
Well, thank you, Monica. Thank you for review. Obviously, the latest development in Congress here about the possibility and maybe the probability of President Obama getting trade negotiating authority makes this scenario, trade, obviously much more dynamic and presents a new challenge for Brazil. With that, I would like to open for questions, starting with Joel Velasco, who is a member of our the Brazil Institute Advisory Board. Joel. Wait for the mic, because we are going to have transcripts of these proceedings. While the mic comes, I find it very interesting also. Last week we had a teleconference with two political policy, on the political side, experts. One, the former spokesperson for President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, André Singer, and the other, Sérgio Fausto, right-hand person for former President Fernando Henrique Cardoso. They are opposites politically, but they're good friends. And we had a very meaningful discussion. What was interesting about the discussion, we will post a summary, and the tape, the video is online, you can watch it, was that they came out to a conclusion that they disagree on certain things, but they think that the country will undergo a political sort of shift, has started towards the center, and the political system will respond in a way that Brazil will get stronger, will get out of this crisis as a much stronger in democracy, etc. So I just wanted to put this there. Watch the video and read the summary that we are going to post later today, because I think it's a part of this context as an important information. Joel, I'm sorry.
So my question is to Paulo, and then if the others could comment on OECD membership. I know there was an announcement recently, and I think Minister Levy is heading to Paris in June. Could you talk about the strategy there, and really to the others, could that be the catalyst for some of the structural reforms opening that would be necessary in the case of extension?
Do you want to take some questions and then?
Yeah, we can take more. Let's, yeah, the two we have here. Gabriel, why don't you start?
Thank you. My question is to, thank you. My question is to Paulo from Fazenda. We've spoken a lot today about the fiscal situation at the federal level. I was wondering if you could comment on the state level, outlook for states' fiscal accounts, and in particular, how Fazenda views the negotiations with Congress now on the new index for state debts, and if that's likely to pass. And as well, if you could comment on any potential or possibility of federal support to the states in light of the anticipated loss of revenue due to the ICMS tax reform. Thank you.
Yeah, I had one question also about the ICMS, which has something to do, obviously, with the efficiency of the economy, what is likely to happen. I saw that the Minister Levy has some problems last week convincing some of the state governments. And this is a topic that I used to work in Brazil in the 1990s and early 2000. I was there. The second question has to do with labor participation, and I lost track, but has anything been done on pension reform, increasing the ages of retirement, putting those programs in more sustainable basis?
Thank you. So, who would start? Paulo, do you want to address some of those questions?
Yeah, maybe later I can make some comments also from, or maybe I should start with this comment, see if you allow me, Paulo.
Yes, sir.
And then address the questions, okay? I really thank you very much for this opportunity, for the comments. I would like to make 4 quick comments based on what my colleagues just said. And I think this hopefully will help to understand the context where that we live right now. So first, I think just to get the facts right, it's a mistake to say that the progress of the middle class right now is a result of welfare measures. It's a simple mistake. It's not a fact. The income growth of the bottom 40% has to do essentially with the functioning of labor market. It's the tightening of labor market in the last 10 years. It's the formalization that happened in the labor market together with the increase in the minimum wage, so the policy to increase the minimum wage. Okay, so this is two-thirds of all the gains, and this is estimated, right? You can look at the literature. The researchers are doing this. It's about two-thirds of this gain it's interesting to say that it's not an exception. The reduction in inequality in the world has been happening through good functioning of labor markets. So why I'm saying this is that, yes, we do have problems. And yes, they will stay there for some time because of choices of the society. Yes, there has been significant progress and sustainable progress. Now, what's the challenge to keep this path going? Increase productivity. Productivity became an obsession for us because that's what is going to make it consistent in the long run, this pattern to continue. Second point, I hear a lot people saying this thing about swimming against the stream and all that. Yeah, there are several streams. There's always streams. What I think, this idea that we're gonna simply collapse because the executive does not have cooperation with Congress has implicit a very dangerous hypothesis. Is that the Brazilian Congress is not responsible for what's happening with the country. Do you really think this? Do we really think that Brazilian Congress will turn its back to the Brazilian population and to taxpayers, to voters, and say, we're going to make this government fail? Do you really think this is a good hypothesis? So I think these differences in views with Congress and the different areas of government, this is part of the democracy. I'm sorry to be stating the obvious. Happened here in the U.S. a few years ago about the debt ceiling. It's happening in Europe and so on and so forth. So I don't want to get to extend too much on this, but I really don't think this is the case. I think the Congress is taking its time to evaluate the measures proposed. It's open to negotiations. We are talking to Congress, and the fiscal adjustment will be the result of this negotiation. Maybe it's not exactly as we wanted, but we will have a solid adjustment as a result of these negotiations, and I have no doubt about it. I don't think anyone in government has. So, and we will deliver the 1.2, just to emphasize this. I have no doubt about it. We're not going to get close. We're going to deliver 1.2. So the third point I think is very important. It's about Petrobras and this issue with construction companies, etc. Again, this is how you look at it, and you can look at the problems that we have right now. But one way to look at it for me is to see that institutions and markets in Brazil are working. What I'm saying this. So you look at any World Bank document or any Transparency International, etc., for the issues of corruption in Brazil. So these are being addressed. These are being addressed, period. And we will come with a solution for that, and an institutional solution through the law, through the legislation, applying the law. Now, some companies will be under stress, yes, and some companies are already doing what? Going to apply for the Brazilian equivalent of the Chapter 11. So the market is taking care of those companies that will, suffer financially from the fact that they're not being paid or they're not, etc. So the point to underline here is that we are not. Sometimes people say, "Oh, this is the end of the world," and I think one of the things that the minister has been emphasizing is that this is a mature country with mature institutions and solid procedures. Out of this process, it's going to take whatever is necessary to take. We're going to have more competition, more transparency, and better governance. I don't think we can be against that too. And finally, sorry, Paulo, to be taking so long, I wanted to make some very quick comments about growth, and I thank you both very much for emphasizing a couple of issues. I wanted to just mention again, we need to recover the capacity of the economy to invest more, invest in infrastructure. That's one of the reasons we're here. We're talking to international investors about the potential, about how we see the concession processes now that BNDES is playing another role. But we also need to invest better. And some calculations show that despite, in the recent years, in the long history of, if you make that decomposition of growth in Brazil, in the last few years is the first time where we have a negative contribution of capital to productivity gains. So, I mean, we need to think carefully about it. The numbers may vary. Monica will know much better than me, but I think there is a growing consensus in the academic community that this has been the case. So that links with what I was saying about the need to introduce more oxygen in the market, more competition, and allow the structural adjustments to happen. And I mean, investments need to happen in sectors that are potentially competitive, in firms, more important than sectors. Sectors are just an abstraction, in firms that are competitive and can grow. So that's the link with the structural adjustment type of issues and competition, I would say. Trade liberalization, we need to be very careful with our international agreements. We think this is it's very important, but we need to be carefully looking at alternatives, as Monica just said, and on the trade liberalization side, with all the caveats that I mentioned before, I think this is part of the competitiveness agenda, so there is no doubt. And finally, I wanted to say that last week, we spent 2.5 days with my former colleagues from the World Bank, particularly the team working with the doing business, showing them the initiatives some initiatives that have been taken to address the 5 worst positions of Brazil in the doing business ranking. We don't have time to get into the details here, but I would be glad to share with you in another occasion. I see that some colleagues from press are here. We are not sure that these results will show in this ranking already because of the methodology, but we will, until the end of May, we will prepare case studies to help the bank to understand how these measures would change the rankings, and maybe later on we can talk about it. Very briefly on the questions, OECD membership, I think it's to be very factual. There is no decision about joining OECD or not, but there is a first step in creating a framework agreement that to some extent consolidate the work that we already have with OECD in several working parties, in several committees. So it's a good for us. It's consolidating, and I think the minister will work through this process and see what is the final interest of the government, what is the timing, but the objective is to create a framework and consolidate the work that we already have with OECD, paving the way. But it's just a way. If we're going to walk through or not, it's going to be something that, and when, is something to be seen. On the fiscal questions, I just wanted to be a little bit more careful here, because you asked about the new index for state debts, federal support to state aids, ICMS, et cetera. I will refrain from answering this. I'm not going to try to convince you that A, B, or C, or that I prefer to refrain from discussions. It's just happening right now. It's too sensitive. And frankly, I don't have the details of what's going on. I've been here for the last, since Sunday, and I really will refrain from that. On the ICMS and the efficiency issue, yes, I think there is a very good example. You know that for sure, but maybe for the audience, the issue is so important that it affects business growth in different ways. For example, if you are an airline, the decision should be what is the optimal network that you have given the size of your airplane and the market that you plan to attend. Because of ICMS issues, you have to factor in where you're going to fuel your where you're going to pump your fuel for that, because depending on where you do that, you have a less ICMS. So it messes up an optimal decision. That is it's very technical, to organize a good airline. So, and I could go on and on in terms of the decision to locate and serve a market vis-a-vis economies of scale. And so it's an optimal decision that is being affected from an artificial situation. Now, Having said that, again, this is something that needs to be resolved with, and I would even dare to say by the government, by the governors themselves, by the states. I think and we are very interested. You saw in the last CONFAS meeting, this was one of the issues, but we will help, if nothing else, by enabling the discussions. And now I'm using my old World Bank hat, and now and it's enabling the discussions. I think it's something that that could help, but if compensation and things like that, I would prefer not to mention anything because I'm simply not well informed at this stage.
Okay, any of you would,
I have one
so,
thing.
yeah, Lisa, why don't you?
Couple of comments in terms of like OECD membership. That's not something, say, there is membership, oh, there's an immediate rating implication. I think clearly it would be, I think we would view it positively as reinforcing Brazil's institutional framework. But it's, I'll give you the example of Mexico, which is, yes, a couple of not just higher on the rating scale, but it's not that its membership has translated into buoyant growth prospects for Mexico. You know, you have had a recent reform effort that we think and will generate important, benefits in the coming years. But I wouldn't say that OECD membership, that's what triggered it. It really will come back to domestic political initiative and decision leadership and follow through with Congress versus, quote, just being a member of the OECD. But clearly, adherence to kind of international standards would be viewed more positively. On state and local governments, just to highlight, we recognize the stresses on revenue performance last year and feeding into this year. And as an example, we, following the affirmation of the sovereign rating, we did actually, though, downgrade several local governments in Brazil, namely the state of Rio de Janeiro and the state of Paraná, to speculative grade, highlighting some of the pressures. And it's not that we're assuming the government's going to be stepping in, but we recognize that there are additional strains through revenue performance, et cetera, that we'll be seeing. I did want to echo the point that Paolo highlighted, which is we have publicly highlighted, and I think just to reinforce, I highlighted more of the negative aspects of the Petrobras corruption investigations, and we do think near term it weighs on the growth story. I mean, as you work through this, but it is a testament to Brazil's institutional framework that these allegations are being vetted. They're being vetted, and you see high-level public as well as private individuals, a follow-through here. And for, peer credits of Brazil, that doesn't necessarily happen. I think that highlights kind of why we also have Brazil investment grade, is their strength in the institutional framework.
Pension liabilities, anything?
On pension, this is a long-standing kind of I would say on the wish list, so to speak, of what you would want to see. I think they're the potentially moving forward on some, adjusting some benefits. I think the fall in the labor force participation rate has to do with some more generosity on pension benefits, as well as on school scholarships. I think the administration has on its agenda to make some adjustments on the margin. But in terms of a real overhaul, in touching real retirement age, I think that's something that we yet to have seen articulated, but that would no doubt be something positive over the, in the coming years.
Monica.
Let me just add one point on the question on labor force participation. One thing that we have seen, and it's been very dramatic in recent years, is a dramatic drop in female participation in labor markets. And this is one area that I know the government is looking into, and one area where, perhaps if some relatively simple things are done, you can get labor force participation back up fairly quickly, and this would obviously aid growth in the short to medium term.
Let's go for one more round of questions. The back there, Juliano. Let's start here, the front. Let's start with Juliano Basile here, and then we move to the back.
Thank you, Paulo Sotero. Juliano Basile from Valor Econômico. I'd like to ask a question to Paulo Correa. The press is always anxious, so I'd like to ask you how long is going to take to this new investment policy that you are launching to get into practical results in Brazil?
in the back there.
This is a question mainly for Lisa, but if Arturo, anyone wants to comment, has to do with how Standard & Poor's analysts or any other rating agencies reconcile, Petrobras' lack of information, financial information, or any other, information that you will need to rate, in this case, a company or even a country. I mean, how do you do that? Is there any other information you take into account? And maybe a follow-up question will be, what will happen if Brazil did, if it loses the credit rating from Standard & Poor's or maybe other rating agencies? Thank you.
Yeah, any more on Petrobras? I think it's important to keep in mind, I think there is an expectation that sometime this month, yeah, next week, that the balance sheets will have been audited, and actually part of the answer will come from that. So, Lisa, why don't you?
I think here, clearly, in general, I think we see that there is a strong flow of information and access to information from Brazil. I think that's also a component that we look at when we're thinking of how we look at our institutional effectiveness governance score component of the rating. You have significant access to information. I would say there's been slippages in terms of where you saw, like on the fiscal policy execution side over the recent years. And using the word, I think transparency is a double-edged, because here, while policy was less transparent, so to speak, the data and the processes in the end are transparent, because the maneuvering, the creative accounting, all comes out. I think that's a testimony to the reporting of data, to the vibrant press, to the broader institutional framework. You have the Tribunal de Contas that is ruling on these pedaladas, and as they've come to light, the Banco Central raising the issue, et cetera. And so it's not positive that it happened, right? It's the same thing with the Petrobras corruption allegations, but the system vets it. And so while it may be a little bit harder, you can work through the fiscal accounts and find out what's recurring revenue, non-recurring revenue. So there is a lot of information. And I think that's an important point to highlight. So we feel very comfortable in terms of on the sovereign side, access to information and dialogue, et cetera. Clearly, we haven't seen the financials reported from Petrobras for the fourth quarter, and there's the questions around impairment, what have you, and this is not my bailiwick, et cetera, but this is fed into kind of the weakening of the standalone credit profile of Petrobras, which, by the way, went down from a little BBB minus to single B plus. So that is a significant reduction in its standalone credit profile assessment because of the realities and some of this information. Now, the rating in the end, the final rating we have on Petrobras hasn't moved, though with the negative outlook, because of the attribution of government support that we would expect. But I think that, again, with our expectation is, that the financials would be coming out. They'll be, and indeed, we had the recent announcement that they'll be coming out next week. And this is clearly something that the Petrobras ratings team will be looking for. In terms of, it's not we have a stable outlook. So we don't, at the moment, don't even see a trend towards losing investment grade, right? Because we have a stable outlook. So if we saw, I think, highlighting what I had said before, an important backtracking in policy. I mean, again, a key thing is the policy commitment and correction that's ongoing, and our assumption that because of the political framework in Brazil, that you will have buy-in eventually from Congress and more broadly, that we're not moving to speculative grade. If there was a backtracking, that would be an important component in our assessment of moving towards speculative grade, because we'd also then have knock-on effects into the fiscal financial profile. So you would have a couple of things coming together.
Paulo, on Juliano's question.
Do I really need to address this question? I could say that in 32 seconds, so start counting. No, but Look, I think, again, I'm sorry to rephrase it, but I think the hypothesis in this, in your question is that we're starting something new from scratch, that it's going to, at some point, it's going to start kicking. This is not the case, okay? So when this is going to start giving results, when this policy of investment will start, it has started. You just saw what happened to Ponte Rio Niterói. Okay, Ponte Rio Niterói is not only a case of a successful case of concessions, but it's a successful result in terms of an illustration of a new model. Subsidized, TJLP, it's 25% of the funding in the end, okay? The bidders, we had, if I'm not mistaken, 6 bidders, or 5 or 6 bidders. The winner was not who prepared the one who ran the PMI. The difference of the reduction in the toll of the winner, 36%, was double of what the company who prepared the project gave as a bid, around 18%, 18% if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so what do we learn from this example? We learned that Ponte Rio Niterói is a well-known asset. The bidding process was announced well in advance. Yes, there are some new investments as well, so it's not simply a brownfield, as you say. So the novelty is when, you know, first, you can do with less PNDS in several cases, and of course that we prefer that it will be leveraging debentures or the sort of project bonds. So first, second point is we have already, when projects are well prepared in advance, the assets, you give time for the market to learn about the assets, to study the assets. The competition will come and the results for the consumers will come. So I think it's a work in progress. And then, not to give an impression that, so why are you here talking to investors? We are here to talk to investors because we need to revamp and explain and communicate better, or continue to communicate, because last years there were some road shows to sell projects. So this is not starting from scratch. It's different here now because we're not in a road show to sell projects yet, but we are here to start a conversation about what has changed under this new fiscal reality of the country.
Okay, thank you very much. Monica, I think you wanted to add, because we have basically run out of time that they committed to.
I just want to make one very, very final point on all the things we've heard and all the things we've heard from Paulo. I think the enormous policy shift that's happening in Brazil, and things like, for example, the measure on BNDES and the issue of project bonds, which really didn't get any resonance in the press in Brazil, surprisingly enough. It should have. It didn't. But I think all of these things should make people realize the following. Necessity is not just the mother of invention. It's first and foremost the mother of policy pragmatism. And I think this is what we're starting to see in Brazil. And, you know, that should give us some ground for optimism rather than just the never-ending pessimism that we currently see in the country. So I just wanted to end on that note.
Well, and on that note, and with some criticism of the media, of the press, which I, as a journalist, love it, because I think we deserve it, I would like to thank Lisa and Paulo, Arturo, Monica very much for the session that I found very enlightening and enriching. This obviously is one of many sessions that we hope to have here at the Wilson Center. You may not, some of you know that Minister Levy, his first engagement here in Washington, actually it was on a snow day when the government shut down, when we had to reopen this building. Yeah, and but he came here for a first, the February 17th, right? Was a very, actually Monica was stuck in a train coming down from New York. But so the conversation started here, obviously. We wanted to continue the conversation here. And I wanted to thank you very much for helping us understand this process, and thank you all for your presence. We will produce the publication based on what was said here today. Thank you very much, and good day.
Next time we see each other, we have better news.